So this idea that there are multiple steady states, and in fact two other types of dynamic rational equilibria exist also. I'm not going to go into that, gets technical. And then what happens in this kind of situation is that an initial shock of some kind, say a financial shock or something else, may set in motion dynamics that will move the economy away from that normal steady state, which are denoted by pi star. And there are different approaches. This possibility of multiple steady states was first actually discovered by Dave Reifschneider and John Williams in a paper some 16 years ago. That was an old-fashioned something called a backward-looking model. Expectations had no role in that model, but nevertheless they realized that interest rates have a lower bound, and that leads to these two intersections, as we saw. Then after that, a couple of years later, started a literature which introduced the rational expectations into this. So there's just a couple of early references here. I came to this area. The rational expectations literature, what it does, those who don't know much economics, it basically says that expectations don't have any independent influence in the system. It's part of the whole big equilibrium in the economy. And that is a fairly strong assumption, or a very strong assumption, depending on who says it. But anyway, that's the idea. And especially if you think of in terms of big shocks and possible change into different kind of situation altogether, why would you have right away rational expectations? I think in those situations in particular, it becomes a very strong assumption. But it's the standard assumption that economists make. And what these people, Jess Ben-Habib, Stephanie Smith-Gorry and Uribe and Mertens Raun and so forth, a fairly large literature, say that they took this seriously and came up with very complicated dynamic paths that are somehow dynamic rational expectations equilibria. Now the learning approach that I have been, much of my career has been focusing on this is rather says that somehow the expectations have an influence to the economy and independent, and they are determined partly by agents looking at history, looking at data, and trying to figure out regularities in the economy, and using these regularities in the economy to make forecasts about the things that they need to forecast, like inflation or future macroeconomic activities. So I've been working many years of this, but I applied, and with actually George Evans is a very long-term collaborator. We started together, work together in the 1980s. We still do work together. So that may be one of the longest collaborations in economics that has happened. Anyway, we wrote actually this is not the first paper, but some of the relevant papers are mentioned here on this. And I'm not going to give you a long list of references. If you're interested, get these slides, and there are 3 papers mentioned there which will have the references. And so that's the third approach in this expectations-driven liquidity trap. As I said, it's one of the approaches that people use in looking at these problems. It's not, but I'll come to the other one in a moment. So anyway, what I will do, I will focus, since it's my own work, I will focus on this, what kind of dynamics do you get out of that, and with the learning and so forth in this context. I will try to minimize the technicalities of this presentation. So that's what I will do in this lecture. But there is another approach which has to be mentioned, because a number of prominent people have used this approach, and I'm going to argue just very briefly that there are some difficulties with this approach. And so there's another approach which basically doesn't, well, they're kind of silent about the multiple equilibria problem. They just focus on one unique equilibrium, which is that target equilibrium. And what they allow for is that they say that there is a fairly long-lasting fundamental shock that shifts that equilibrium to the region where interest rates are effectively zero. So if you remember that first diagram where we had the Fisher straight line and the interest rate curve, the idea is that somehow the Fisher equation shifts downwards and moves that target equilibrium to values where the low interest, where that interest rate is very low and where that pi star also becomes very low. And for a couple of examples of those, one is that there could be problems in financial intermediation. That would create a premium between the policy rate and the rate that the interest rate that the consumers and firms face. That would be effectively shifting that curve down, that Fisher equation down. One other possibility is time preferences. So this is, and there's a large literature on here. You see some very prominent names like Mike Woodford, Lars Svensson, Larry Cristiano, etc. in this, and they emphasize these financial intermediation problem with that deviation between policy rates and the interest rates that consumers and firms face. Then let me just skip the last one, not very much about the empirical literature at this stage, but then the other problem here is that if you go this way and think of in terms of the shifting Fisher curve, you better be careful, because if the shock is too big or too persistent, the intersections will disappear altogether. There's no equilibrium. What does then happen? Certain irrational expectations cannot tell anything in that situation, and so that's a problem there. The other problem is that this kind of, as I said, it requires a fairly long-lasting shock. They actually model it as something called a two-state Markov chain, with a return probability of getting back, or return time on average to get back to the usual pre-shock stage of 7-8 years. Well, Japan has been in this problem almost 20 years, and the other part of the Western world are getting to the 7-8 years, and are we getting out of this? We will see. Maybe not in time to be with that assumption, as I said, and you can't move that assumption very much around. So it relies on a couple of sensitive assumptions. Moreover, what happens in these models that people use here is that even if you move that target equilibrium down, how much does the output level or employment level move in this kind of new Keynesian models? It turns out it moves very little, because in the long run, the Phillips curve in these models is almost vertical. And as we saw in those figures, the zero low bound had a major impact on real output. So it's not a very good story, maybe. Anyway, so let me now get to this further part of the story, which is this: how do we model these expectations-based liquidity trends?